Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the latest edition of the Outdated Wrestling Hour. We're going to do some retro wrestling looking stuff. Well, you know what I mean. Going way back to look at the territory days. You know, I found an old cassette tape of me talking to my mom about wrestling. I was such a young tadpole. Would you like to hear it? Well, here it is. Shoot, I put on the wrong cassette. It's the Outdated Wrestling Hour. Hello, everybody. This is Bob Smith, the former editor with all those wrestling magazines, including Pro Wrestling Illustrated, back in the day. And welcome back to the Outdated Wrestling Hour. We are glad you're back. We have a very special guest today in Gene Jackson. He is the host of the Retro Wrestling Review on the WrestleCopia Network, and that show takes a deep dive into the USWA territory virtually every week. Gene goes back in time to rewatch and review pro wrestling from years gone by. You know that's up my alley, and I think it would be up your alley too. So I want you to meet Gene. I just had the privilege of appearing on his show, and now he's doing my show. In fact, we recorded both shows on the exact same day, one after another. We are gluttons for punishment, if you know anything about podcasting. So anyway, get a hot toddy, toast some marshmallows. You know, it's summertime, and I really feel alive. And hang on, we'll be right back. We'll have a commercial break and then bring on Mr. Gene Jackson. Really opened my eyes, this young fella, and I think you're going to get a kick out of this. Stay tuned if you know what's good for you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Wrestling Fans International Association is back. That's right, the premier fan club association of the 1970s and 1980s has been revived and is back in business. Join today. It's free at thewfia.org. That's thewfia.org. You can also join us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/WFIA 1969.
As I sit here talking to you all, I just had the privilege of being on a really great podcast. And now I have the host of that podcast on my podcast. It is the Retro Wrestling Review podcast that focuses on the USWA. And here is your host, Gene Jackson. Hey, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me, Bob. Man, we had a lot of fun with you on my podcast, and now I'm getting to be on a podcast that I listen to each and every week. So this is exciting.
Man, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. And I'm just here, I've always looked at the nostalgia wrestling podcast people as a community. I don't compete with the other guys. I'm better than this or this is better than that. I'm just part of a crowd trying to keep the old school alive, And I think you're doing that too, to a great extent. And you talk about my favorite territory, the USWA, or for lack of a better term, Memphis.
Yeah, I do the regional wrestling podcast with Ray Russell, where we talk about 1985 Memphis. And I really enjoy that. We have a lot of fun covering that. And I've got a YouTube channel, Retro Wrestling Network, and I started kind of a project of just putting up every bit of USWA wrestling I had in my collection, which is a good majority of it. And as I was putting it up, I was watching it, and I told Ray, I was like, man, there's no podcast out there dedicated to USWA. Like everything's kind of in the 80s. Now, USWA just doesn't get a lot of love for some reason. I said, I wonder why. And, him and a couple of other friends was just like, well, if there's not one, maybe you're the guy that needs to create one. And I kind of laughed it off. Then I got to think about it. I'm like, well, why not? So I hit up a couple of friends of mine that do a wrestling / kind of a comedy podcast. And the one, Josh Briley, he's Nightmare Danny Davis's nephew, and the other gentleman, Richard Mulligan, used to wrestle for Corey Macklin's Memphis Wrestling, and so they have knowledge, but they're also funny guys, and they enjoy it. And so I kind of recruited them as co-hosts, and so they're my weekly co-host. And then when they aren't available, I bring in other people. And we've been having a lot of fun, man, and I've been overwhelmed with the feedback because I did have a couple of close friends of mine who do podcasts. I'm not going to bury them by saying their names here. Who are like, you're crazy. Nobody's going to listen to a 90s era USWA podcast. That's not going to happen, man. You're going to crash and burn. I go, well, as long as we have fun, if 10 people listen to it, then I hope those 10 people enjoy it. But, we've been charting, and like I say, our Facebook page has grown up to nearly 3,000 followers, and I get a lot of feedback from those people each and every week, and they're asking questions and they're giving insight. And the videos, I got videos on there, they're getting 50 to 80,000 views. I got a heel Bob Armstrong in Memphis in 1995 when he was the heel Smoky Mountain commissioner. That video so far has got 98,000 views, which warms my heart.
Well done. Jeez. That's all. Those numbers stagger me, as they say in the producers. Wow. No, actually, Larry said that, the Three Stooges. The figures stagger me when they thought they won the $50,000 in the cigarette contest. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I see you guys in the charts, hovering right around where I am, and I think that's great. How long have you been at it at this point?
I mean, we're only about 12 episodes in on this USWA podcast. I've been doing podcasts since like 2007 when it was just, me, Mark Maron, and Colt Cabana, and about 6 other people doing podcasts. And I've always just kind of done podcasts interviewing local wrestlers and different things. Now, back then, when I first started, and there was only like 12 podcasts, it was easy to get. I interviewed Bruno Sammartino and Jimmy Hart and Jim Cornette and all these great people. And eventually, when the market started getting crowded, it started getting harder to get weekly guests, and I kind of moved away from that. But yeah, this USWA podcast we're only up to in fact, the episode me and you just recorded was episode number 11, and we've got a couple others in the can. But yeah, it's brand new.
All I know is you smashed top 50 already, so congratulations. That's pretty good. That's really good. It's, we were talking on your show. There's so many wrestling podcasts. Somebody told me there's like 900 if you go international, and that's probably undercutting it. There's every wrestler, every style of wrestling, every federation, history podcasts, modern podcasts, review podcasts of a certain week's show and stuff like that. Just go down the list. There's 1,000 of them. It's daunting, but to get any ears at all is a nice job. And obviously you've deserved it, because I think there's a lot more USWA boosters than people think there are.
I'm learning that. I'm definitely learning that. I questioned that going in because there was some, like I say, there was some negativity out there, but man, I'm learning that there's a lot of them out there. And I mean, like, Jerry Lawler's Facebook, that I'm told is either ran by Jerry Lawler or someone close to him, shares a lot of our videos and shares, links to our show. And so that's helped us get a lot of followers, and, quite a few of the wrestlers from that era have, been sharing it and watching it. And I've reached out to some of them. We're going to get some interviews with them. We had Wolfie D on recently. Downtown Bruno is going to be coming on soon. And, he had me send him a Retro Wrestling Review USWA podcast t-shirt. He said he's going to be wearing around for appearances and things. So that should be good publicity for us. But, Yeah, man. And I was excited to hear you say that, you're a big fan of USWA. And of course, we got a chance to talk on my podcast about your experience going down to Memphis and how cool that was. And yeah, I'm jealous. That's amazing.
I finally figured out how to put into words what we talked about in your podcast. I think the reason you're doing so well is that you're offering people a chance to see the USWA, which is the major league not enough people got to see when it was new,
Yeah.
right? It was a major league. Make no mistake, Memphis was a territory. USWA was a territory. And we're talking pre-Dallas expansion. It was several cities in, every week, or at least every other week in Memphis, and it was a region. It wasn't just, Memphis on Saturday morning TV, and of course the Saturday morning TV show was pretty doggone cool in and of itself, I think.
Oh yeah. It was a weekly advertisement for the Monday night cards. And of course, then they would chop that up and send it around, and it became a weekly advertisement for the Evansville card and the Nashville card and the Louisville, all the different towns in the territory. You had the 90-minute version, Memphis, that was live, and then you chop that up into a 60-minute version, and you cut out the stuff that wasn't relevant to the other towns and plugged in localized promos. And that's the system they went with for years and years and years. And when we started this podcast, I pondered on this for a long time, but based on the footage I had available at the time and based on what I thought would reach the broadest audience, we decided to start in January of 93, because you start having all these WWF people coming in, that year. That's when, you had Brett and Owen Hart and The Undertaker and different people coming through, Doink the Clown, and a lot of fun stuff. Eventually now, and this is another great thing too, Bob, is since I started doing this, I've had all these people reach out to me and like, hey, you said you were missing, episodes of 94 and 95, 96, 97. What are you missing? And they've been giving me links to Google Drives, and I've filled in a majority of those missing episodes. I've still got some stuff to fill, but I filled in a lot. So eventually, we're going to work our way through the years, and we're probably going to circle back to like 1990. And I hope by the end of this, we will have covered every available episode of USWA Championship Wrestling. And so what we do, for those of you who haven't had a chance to, and we do audio and a video version on the YouTube channel. We go through and we review the entire episode, and we play clips of some of the main angles and clips from the matches. And we have fun with it. We don't dog it, but if there's, it's Memphis, there's going to be some silly stuff on there sometimes, Bob, as well as I do. There's moments of time where you kind of roll your eyes and like, man, what were they thinking there? And, we have fun with that, but we don't mock it, and we don't make fun of it, but we don't try to sell you on, when some of the silliness happens, we don't sit and try to beat you over the head with like, this was great stuff. It's just like, well, don't know what they were thinking there, but here's how it played out, and let's see where it goes next week. And that's the fun thing about them. They usually came back from it.
I always think of Tagar. To me, that was like, it looked, oh man, I can't even imagine. Well, Jerry Lawler was a big monster fan. He loved horror movies and science fiction and stuff like that. That had to be a Jerry Lawler creation. I don't know if it was. It didn't last very long, and thank goodness for that.
It had to be. But like, I share all these videos on there, and we shared a video of a tag team. I think they lasted 2 weeks. They were called the Fat Boys, Meat and Potatoes. And they wrestled about as well as that gimmick implies. And that video has gotten over like 22,000 views since we put it up on the Facebook page. And it's gotten a ton of comments, and it's just, it was a gimmick of the time. And it went for a couple of weeks. Tagar, same thing. Tagar, Lord of the Volcano, had a couple of promos, and then he showed up, and he was shorter than Lawler. I mean, because you just picture a big Kane type character, that was going to come in. He's going to be 6'9". It might be Sid Vicious, but who knows? And this guy was shorter than Lawler in this goofy little outfit, and he lasted a couple of weeks, and Lawler beat him, and we moved on.
Yes.
And that's
as it should have been. Yes. Hey, is there any Rough and Ready fans out there that you're finding out? They were on TV getting killed most of the time.
They're more of the CWA era. So we haven't had them on TV, but I would assume there has to be some Rough and Ready fans out there. Lord knows
I thought they were still working when I was.
About 93. What we've covered so far in 93, they haven't turned up. Now in the 90, 91, 92, they may have showed up in that era, but we hadn't started covering any. We had, like I said, we're have to circle back to that. So in 93, they haven't been there. But surely they'll turn up at some point. But yeah, I always enjoyed Rough and Ready and Boss Winners.
And the best was listening to Lance Russell announce Rough and Ready, the cadence that he had in his great voice.
Yes. That's one thing that saddens me is 93 where we started. Lance hasn't returned yet. He came back in 94. So no Lance Russell right now, but we got Dave Brown. We got Corey Macklin in there. And he loves to say in there at the end of we said we'd start a drinking game with that, but we wouldn't get through a podcast.
My favorite Corey Macklinism. That's ridiculous.
Oh, yes.
Right?
That's ridiculous. Brian Christopher.
That's really good. Yeah, that's well done. That sounds like him. Yeah. Oh, man. I can't tell you how much fun we had in the PWI days. Like I said, we used to get the tapes. And when I was working, and one of our other staffers was enamored with Brian Christopher and his little red wagon. If you remember that bit for a while around, I guess it was around 91, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh boy, this guy, I love this guy. He's always protecting his little red wagon. I said, this is what you're into? But no, he was a fan. So Brian became a favorite around our offices because of his little red wagon. Whatever gets you over, right?
Brian was and especially in 93, by then, he's a couple of years in and they're starting to push him. He was such a great heel. Like if you're just a mainstream wrestling fan and you only know, Grandmaster Sex Save from Too Cool, and that was great for his career. It did a lot for him. But if you didn't get to see the heel Brian Christopher in Memphis, I implore you to at least watch a few episodes of our show just to see, because that is Brian, in my opinion, at his best. And in recent weeks, he's starting a feud with Jerry. And of course, at that point, we're no way acknowledging that that's Lawler's son. They say a couple little tongue-in-cheek things that if you know, but it's no way really. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know type things. But just, he did a great, the first month of the podcast that we're covering and we covered in January of 93, Jeff Jarrett and Brian Christopher were feuding over the Southern Heavyweight title. And so Jeff had the Southern Heavyweight title and Brian had these valets, he called them his managers, but as these guys, and he had like this guy named Zeke Rivers, and he had Mike Samples and Burt Prentice, and Lauren Davenport was in and out. And so each week he's putting up one of those people's hair against Jeff's belt. He won't put up his hair, but every week he's putting up one of his flunkies' hair, Mr. Clyde, who was an enhancement guy. And so, we go down the line until finally we get to Brian, and everybody's like, all right, Brian's getting his head shaved, and then he wins the title. And so we're off to the races with Brian as Southern champion. And again, that's, like we talked about on my podcast, there's things that you could do in Memphis. You couldn't do 6 weeks of hair matches in Texas or Jim Crockett Promotions, but in Memphis, they would pull off these promos and these live shows every week that by the time you sat through the promo, it somehow made sense. You bought into it. And when you try to explain it to your friends afterwards, like, yeah, man, they're going to be having a match where he's going to put the belt against, so-and-so's hair. And like, well, didn't you say last week they put it against the other guy's hair? Like, yes, but you got to understand what happened. See, this guy came out but somehow they made it feasible. And it's a lot of fun. But boy, they went to that hair match a lot just in the 2 months we've covered so far. Boy, we went there a lot because you'd have Brian's match doing it. Then over here, you got the Moondogs against the Harris brothers. And now Mike Samples and Richard Lee are putting their hair up against each other. And there was way more gimmicks we could have went to than just those matches.
I'll put it this way about the USWA, though. From a studio to a full arena, what more need I say? Or at least a well-attended arena and they did it every doggone week, which shows how the people were really into all those angles and all those stars. And, there were people who were stars in Memphis and weren't stars anywhere else, but they were looked upon as big stars while they were there. I mean, you take a Wolfie D, right? That type
Yeah.
of a guy. Eric Embry,
Yeah.
who was in Southwest, is somewhat of a star in Southwest, but once he hit Memphis, I think he really hit his stride and became the Eric Embry that everybody remembers at that point. There's so many you could name. It's crazy.
Well, Bill Dundee, was
Right.
successful in other territories, but he wasn't a main eventer anywhere but Memphis. But he was just below Lawler throughout most of their careers in Memphis. And then he had a lot to do with the booking at different times, and he was a big deal there. And those two were so talented. I've said this many times over the years to friends, and I've even said it on a couple of podcasts. But Bill Dundee and Jerry Lawler were so talented. And Bob, I want to see if you would agree with this, or you may tell me I'm crazy. But I've said for years, if you went back to the kayfabe era, you could have put a camera in the TV5 parking lot, showed a car pulling into the parking lot with Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee in that car together. They could get out of that car together, walk shoulder to shoulder through the doors of the studio, out to the desk to Lance Russell or Dave or whoever's there, and started a promo together. And in the course of that promo, you could have Bill turn heel and Lawler's the babyface, and they argue and things get a little heated. At some point, they could swap roles to where almost Lawler's the heel and Dundee's the babyface. They could swap a couple different times and then sell you on a match that you had to go see Monday night at the Coliseum, and you would go along for that entire ride and buy every bit of it because both guys were so believable, and there was that perceived tension between the two of them that to this day, people who know them cannot tell you for sure if those guys have ever been friends or if they really like or hate each other. But it was so evident watching them over the years that even though you saw them ride up together, and you could probably see them get in the car and leave together, honestly, but you're like, those guys are going to kill each other Monday night. We got to go see how this is going to play out, because they were two of the best.
Yeah. And believability is the word you use, and that is the key. In Memphis, the fans believed. They really did. I mean, if you go back to the Lawler-Kaufman feud, they believed all of it, every word of it, every moment of it. I mean, and all the other great feuds they had, Funk Lawler. You just go through the history of Memphis wrestling. They were into everything that happened. Austin Idol Lawler, just Randy Savage Lawler. Just keep going and going and going. It was the believability that made USWA and Memphis special, I think.
Absolutely. And I think a great formula they had, and it was at its peak during his time there, but they used it a little more over the years. But during that era in the 80s, where you established, once he came back from breaking his leg, the feud with Jimmy Hart and Jerry Lawler. That was the root of the feud. You knew Lawler hated Jimmy Hart because when Lawler broke his leg, Jimmy Hart denounced him on TV, called him you shoot him because like a horse with a broken leg. And for years after that, once Lawler came back, you had this feud between Lawler and Hart, and you could bring anybody to town. Didn't matter. They could be enhancement talent in another territory. But if you brought them out there and sent them out on TV with Jimmy Hart, and they said, I'm going to beat Lawler for Jimmy Hart this week, they're a main eventer. Fans are coming to see it. And Jimmy Hart's heat transferred to every person they paired with him. And, they duplicated that over the years to some degree with the Scott Bowdens of the world and different people, never to the extent they did with Jimmy Hart. But I always thought that was genius in a weekly territory where it was so easy to burn people out and to a feud to get old. You couldn't just go for months like they did other places to keep the feud between Lawler and Hart, but the matches are fresh because you're rotating out who Jimmy Hart's managing. I thought that was pretty genius.
And the thing I liked about Memphis too is when somebody would leave, and invariably they would, a lot of the big stars that were transit, people forget Rick Rude was in there, and you just go back through the history of Memphis wrestling, everybody passed through. Hulk Hogan did. Everybody. If you can name them, Ric Flair did. I mean, they were all in and out of there. But the fans held in high esteem the people who stayed there, the Bill Dundees, the Billy Travis's, the Eddie Gilberts, the people that would always come back and always draw.
Yeah. They could go anywhere in the country, but Dundee, Eddie Gilbert, Buddy Landale, Austin Idol, Dutch Mantell, whenever they fell on hard times or a promoter made them unhappy and they decided to walk out, they knew they could pick up the phone, they could be back in Memphis next Monday night, and they could be making money. And without fail, they were always able to.
That's why I miss the territories, because the turnover of stars, they'd go to Alabama, they'd go to Canada, they go whatever. The turnover of stars is what made wrestling fresh all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember him. He's back. Or I've never seen him before, but I've read about him in the magazines, That type of changeover created excitement in and of itself, I think. What's he doing? What's Kamala doing back here? Those type of things.
Yeah.
Another great Jerry Lawler creation, by the way. Just all of his thousands of creations, that one really rung a bell. But that's how creative Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee, and you just go down the list. It was their creativity and their constant willingness to take a risk with an angle that made it so exciting there all the time.
And then, they could take a team like the Moondogs, who it wouldn't work in Jim Crockett Promotions. It might not even work in like World Class, but they got over a year's worth of a feud with the Moondogs against Lawler and Jarrett, or Jarrett and Fuller, either combination, almost every single Monday night for over a year of chairs swinging and going through tables and concession stands and, just wild brawls. And the people didn't tire of it. And as a matter of fact, it was voted Pro Wrestling Illustrated Feud of the Year in 1992. So
I was there. And that was legit, my friends. And I want to say this one more time. Those winners were the winners. We didn't have promoters telling us. It was the fans who made those choices. Now, how that many fans got to see Memphis Wrestling, or just because they read about them in our books, I don't know. But all I know is that deserved to be Feud of the Year, because first you had Richard Lee and his Moondogs. I forget which Moondogs they were, to be honest with you. Their names Spike and Cujo or whatever, whatever they were at that point. But their TV squashes were hard to watch. They would literally beat the living bejesus out of those preliminary guys. It was hard to watch. They'd bash with chairs for like 10 minutes, right?
It was brutal. And in 93 that we're covering right now, the Moondogs had turned babyface. So Richard Lee and the Moondogs are a babyface tag team, and they bring in the Bruise Brothers, Ron and Don Harris, with Mike Samples, and they start in a feud, and it becomes like a game of one-upsmanship of who can beat the enhancement guys worse in their match, the Moondogs or the Harris brothers. And so instead of just two like job guys getting brutalized or what, you had at least four, because the Moondogs would come out and just beat a couple of guys half to death, and then the Harris brothers would come out and try to up the ante, and they're throwing people over the desk. We watched one recently where they backdropped a guy on the studio floor out there. I mean, it was, I mean, all these years later, you're still sitting there watching it cringing and feeling bad for these guys. Like, oh my gosh, like somebody's got to stop this. This is terrible. But, and those guys, we've been doing this show for 2 months or more, and the Moondogs and the Harris twins have fought every Monday night since we've been doing it. And they've found creative ways to keep the feud going. Titles are on the line. People's hair's on the line. Different weapons are allowed and not allowed. And that was the trick in Memphis. You once you think it's got to be over with, no, they find another way to freshen it up and squeeze another couple of weeks out of it.
And that era was so influential, because right around that time, I got to know a guy named Todd Gordon, who went on to found ECW, and his very words were on my show is that he created Eastern Championship Wrestling as a way to bring Memphis style wrestling to Philadelphia. That's his actual statement he made to me.
Yeah.
That's how influential that brawling Memphis style was.
Yeah, and they definitely upped the ante, and over time, raised the stakes on the violence and the blood, and but yeah, you definitely could tell that's what it was rooted in, was definitely Memphis wrestling, back to the old concession stand brawl, and right up the road from where I was born and raised in Tupelo there, with Lawler and Dundee against the Blonde Bombers. And of course, Larry Latham of the Blonde Bombers would go on to be Moondog Spot, who was in, the moon almost, you mentioned it varied on those Moondogs, but most of the time it was Spot, and then the other one would rotate out. You'd have, Cujo and Spike and Rex and Splat and all these different ones, but usually Spot figured in there somewhere. But yeah, I mean, they definitely influenced ECW, but they influenced a lot more promotions than I think they get credit for, and that's why they were one of the last territories standing. When the territories started dying out, they were one of the last holdouts,
if not the last one. Because I know Smoky Mountain filtered away. Continental was before them. Calgary was gone. Nothing in California. Florida was dead. So I'm trying to think who was left. And it's like, I really honestly think Memphis was the last of its breed, the last of its kind. If there was someone else still running, I can't think of who it was. I'm no genius, I'm no historian, but I was around at the time, and I can't think of who it might have been other than Memphis. And I understood that
Ohio Valley, but they were, by that point, they were already a WWF developmental, and they weren't an original territory anyway. So of the original territories, Memphis was definitely the last.
Yeah, and when I say territory, not just one show in one place. Like now we have world champions that work, in back of a garage in Altoona, Pennsylvania. No, but you know what I mean? It's like, to me, a territory is at least 5 cities or 5 towns. Yeah. That's, to me, is that's just what my perception of a territory is.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be, or else it's a promotion. It's just a promotion in a place. And
right.
I remember when in '88, the AWA was a dying territory. But for me, as an 11-year-old kid, Jerry Lawler defeating Kurt Hennig to win the AWA world title was like just huge. I went to school because, obviously I was, 2 hours away in Mississippi. I didn't get to go to the show that night and see it, but Channel 5 News, besides just showing Memphis wrestling on Saturday mornings, Big Jack Eaton in the sports report on Monday nights would give you the results from the Mid-South Coliseum. So I stayed up that night. And of course, many a nights I had watched and been disappointed over the years as Lawler wrestled Bockwinkel and, different ones. But I felt good about this one. I had spent the money to call and vote for Jackie Fargo to be the special referee. I talked my parents to let me call at least 3 times. $1.25 a pop or whatever it was. And Jackie was going to be the referee, and Lawler won. And I remember going to school the next day, and it's like, Jerry Lawler won the world title. And they're like, who's Jerry Lawler and what world title? What are you talking about? But I was pretty hyped about it. And to me, it seemed like a huge deal. And he came to Tupelo to the Toyota dealership, and my mom took me down there, and I got to take a picture with Jerry Lawler, and I got to take a picture with the AWA world title. And it was just, up to that point, probably the greatest day of my life.
Well, that was the last great thing to happen for the AWA too, because you say what you want. I know they were dying, but Hennig was a viable champion and those great matches on ESPN with Nick Bockwinkel and stuff. Yeah. And not long after that, you got Lawler. He's coming to Memphis. Hennig was, and gets beat by Lawler. I think it still had enough panache to make it a big deal. The last AWA big deal, but that it was still a big deal. I felt anyway, because they were on ESPN. Perception is, weekly national TV should have meant something even then. So, that was a huge deal. It was a huge deal to us. After went down to Memphis to cover it. I remember that.
Yeah, I thought it was huge, and then the follow up to it, Super Clash 3, was what it was, and that's. To me, like, as if Jerry Lawler winning the title was up here, the Super Clash unification match was when it took a nosedive off a cliff. But podcast for another day.
That couldn't have been booked worse if they tried. It just no. And the whole card was disjointed. That was. Do you remember the original pay-per-view? They showed that match, and then they had like 2 other matches after that. I'm thinking, who wanted to see, rock and roll RPMs after that, or whoever the heck it was, because they had 3 or 4 promotions
Yeah.
involved, and I guess everybody had to have their time. They had Glow Girls there working. It was a disaster.
The
And
matches felt like they were
the
drawn
buy
out of
rate
a hat. It felt like one of those battle bowls or something. A lot, some of those matches, like I say, it was a mismatch of promotion. So just some of the matches had a build up, and there was, kind of made sense. But some of the matches was like, how did we even land on this match? And then, of course, and inevitably, whenever you have multiple promotions involved, the finishes are what suffer because nobody wants to go under clean. So then you start getting all these weird, DQs and different stuff. And of course, the unification title match was the epitome of that.
Right.
How that can go wrong. And then, like you said, the fans have just seen Kerry Von Erich look like he had been shot in the face, nearly bleed out in the ring, as far as they know. And then now we're watching the RPMs and random matches after the fact. It's just one of the most, what could have been a huge deal for all those promotions was just so poorly executed. And then when you get to the other side of it with all the money disputes and all that and the ugliness that came out of it, it's just sad.
Many people insist they never got paid, including Lawler.
That's right. No, so then that led to the belt, him taking the belt controversy, and they stripped him, and Larry won it in a battle royal and all that. But that's going down a whole nother road that we'll say for another day. But I don't know. I just always like to bring up, what a big deal to me it was that Lawler won the world title. And as after that, the world title never left Memphis because we unified it, and then we established a separate unified belt, and that stayed there through the end of the territory.
Right.
All kinds of people held that belt for us over with Coco and King Cobra and Reggie B. Fine, and up to Sid Vicious and Bam Bam Bigelow and all kinds of people.
I was there, I think, when I was in Memphis when Sid won the belt from Lawler. Yeah, I was there for a title change. That's right. I was there to visit. Remember I told you on the show I visited when they were working that whatever it was, a flea market or something like that.
Yeah,
and
the big one.
I think the story was that Jake Roberts was supposed to have been in the main event and did not show. Lawler, being we can't disappoint these people type of guy, had Sid go over. So Sid came back in the dressing room with the belt, and I said, "Holy smoke!" Because I was sitting behind the curtain for that show. And here comes, I said, "Holy smokes, what happened out there?" And I talked to Lawler after that. I said, well, he says, "You can't disappoint people like that. They were here to see Jake Roberts against me. You got to give them something to make them forget about all that." Right? I agree with you.
That's very smart.
Yeah.
And to me at the time, like I was old enough at that point, me and some of my buddies were starting to make some trips to Memphis, and for us, it was a big deal for Sid to be back in Memphis by that time. He had his runs in WCW and WWF, and he was a big star. And, we were pretty psyched to go to Memphis and get to see Sid and Lawler wrestle a few different times. And, he had a pretty good run there in between his times in WWF and WCW and, whatnot. And, he still looked good and had some good matches there. So that was pretty cool.
Sid had it. Whatever it is, he had it.
Yeah.
From the minute I saw him in a tiny Georgia Federation, I said, "This guy, he didn't even have to do anything. He just had to show up." He had that incredible look. I mean, he was everything I think a wrestling promoter could have wanted, and at least in terms of visage, in the way he looked, how big he was, how naturally strong he was, and when he did the skyscrapers in the NWA, I remember the matches would last like a minute 40. But once he did that, power slam, that's what people paid to see.
I mean, I remember going.
Sid was something else, man. Very underrated in terms of how influential he was during his prime.
I remember him being in Continental and going down to Columbus when he first was starting out in the business. One of his first territories, he was Lord Humongous, and had Downtown Bruno as his manager, and he was working with Danny Davis. And I remember watching those matches, and then years later, like hearing Bruno and Danny Davis talk about, in interviews about how, really, really green Sid was at the time. Because I remember watching those matches, and it was basically just him choking Danny Davis and clotheslining him, and it was really, really basic, and then, talking about Sid, he was fresh out. I mean, he hadn't really been trained. He'd just been kind of taken in a ring and shown some basic stuff. And, Danny Davis was literally just walking him through those matches step by step by step. And looking back on it, it's like, wow, it's pretty cool to have seen somebody in their formative years to go on and beat, to years later, he's at WrestleMania, The Undertaker, and he's Texas with Shawn Michaels at that big Royal Rumble to do all the things he did. And then you've seen him down there and a hockey mask and, the arena in Columbus, stumbling his way through probably one of his first 10, 20 matches at best.
Mm-hmm.
Danny Davis was a super talented guy that had he been taller, there's no telling the career he could have had outside of Memphis and Continental, because he was a really good wrestler. And then once in '88, once he hit the gym and really started getting ripped, he wasn't, at that time, WWF wasn't ready to do anything with anybody who wasn't, well over 6 feet tall. And, WCW just used him as a enhancement guy under a mask. But man, what a great wrestler. He was, he was fiery in his promos, and in the 90s USWA that we're covering, he was a great star.
When I was there, when I went down in 91, I saw an opening match between, his name was Rob Stakowski at that point, Rob Van Dam, very young, very green, against Danny Davis as an opener. And I insist to everyone, I've mentioned it about 50 times on my show, best opener I've ever seen in my life. Because I didn't expect the moves that Rob Van Dam had, but Danny Davis was keeping up with him. And I'm telling you, it was like a teacher-student type of match. Awesome. And Davis went over, obviously, because of the pecking order back then. But it was about as good. I remember walking, I had to go in the back, and I remember just blurting out, and I didn't even know if I was listening. I go, that's the best opener I ever saw. And Eddie Marlin looks at me and goes, yeah, I think you're right. So, I don't know if it's because I was there, the national press was there or whatever, and maybe the guys were putting on the best shows they could. But all I know is that that was amazing. So Danny Davis could go, man. He was, you're right. If he was like 5 inches taller.
Oh, yeah.
Seriously. Sometimes that works against you. It doesn't always. I mean, look at Bill Dundee, look at Taz, look at other people that have come and gone.
Yeah.
But, he made his mark in other ways. He's a legend just for being who he is.
I was going to say, just even though he didn't get to have the in-ring career that maybe he deserved, you look at, him running Ohio Valley and the training he did, you look at the number of stars that his fingerprints are on. I know it wasn't just him. You had Cornette, you had, other people, but if you look at the graduates of the Ohio Valley Wrestling School who were, signees of WWF, the Lesners and Ortons and Cenas and Shelton Benjamins and on down the line, that all are tied to Danny Davis, he like you said, he definitely made his mark.
Oh, there's a show in that. The influences behind the scenes that you don't realize, or too many fans don't realize. Mm-hmm. Like him and like a Fit Finley, there's so many guys. Al Snow, just go down the list of guys who were behind the scenes, nudging the new talent along and helping in their careers. There's probably 25 of them, really, if you look at Johnny Rods here in the East and stuff like that. There's so many. But Danny Davis really deserves his props because he. How many stars did he help churn out? My gosh,
tons. And he gets a lot of credit from those guys. You hear him, mention it in shoot interviews and different things. And, I wish more people maybe mention him in his Hall of Fame speeches and stuff. But, and he's gotten a shout out in a couple of them, but maybe not as many as he's deserved to. The day John Cena's up there, I hope we hear him mention, Danny Davis and OVW. Perhaps he will. But so I want to kind of, so we're going to break away from USWA talk for a minute. I know this is your show. I don't want to hijack it, but we talked about at the beginning of this about, me doing podcasts and how the fact this USWA podcast, hasn't been going along for real long. We're just like 10 or 12 episodes in. But this review, the whole style of this show, it's not the first one I did with clips and this whole layout. About 2 years ago, I talked to my buddy Bob Anderson, and I was like, hey, man, do you want to do a wrestling podcast? And he's like, yeah, I might be interested. I'm like, well, I got this idea for this weekly review show. And it took some convincing, but at the time, that a Dark Side of the Ring had came out, and there was this resurgence and interest in it. And I talked him into doing a weekly Herb Abrams UWF podcast where we started with episode 1 of Herb Abrams Fury Hour, and we were going to watch an episode a week and show clips and talk about them. And the intent was we were going to go through the whole run of UWF, and we were going to cover the pay-per-views and all that. And 12 episodes in, Bob tapped out, and he's like, I can't watch this anymore. I can't do it. I cannot do it. He's like, there hasn't been a clean finish in a main event yet. And so we stopped doing it. But the reason I bring this up is as someone involved in the magazines in the era that this promotion existed, what did you guys think of Abrams and that promotion and just everything that went along with it?
Okay. Not knowing Herb Abrams, I was there at their New York debut tapings for the first 2 or 3 of them. I was literally there, literally ringside. I'm thinking back to it. I didn't know anything about Herb Abrams. I think After did. The first one, I was very excited. I like all of us in WWF land, everybody's hungry for an alternative.
Yeah.
And they were running shows directly across from where Madison Square Garden was at a hotel, the Hotel Penta or the Hotel Pennsylvania. Right. And a big ballroom. And it's perfect. And it looked great on TV. The ballroom looked beautiful. And I was kind of excited after the first one. But then I saw the second one. And then I saw the third one. It was over by then. I mean, it was like I've never seen something become so frenetic and thrown together. And it was the perfect example of, I hate to use the term money mark, but this is what was going on. And I can't describe it. It became a non-entity with me within 6 months.
Yeah.
And the TV show got worse and worse and worse. In the beginning, they had Craig Minervini and Bruno Sammartino, and then they both disappear. And you had Herb screaming into the microphone for a while. And then I can't remember this unbelievably bad feud of Herb versus this manager guy who nobody
Colonel Red.
Yes, and it was deplorable, and it got worse and worse and worse. And the last UWF show I ever remember watching, one of his helpers was doing dubbed-in play-by-play with a squeaky-voiced guy, and I'm like, "There's no hope." I mean, this made anything Mary Savoldi look like a major pay-per-view. I mean, it was as bad as anything I've ever seen. And I'm not putting anybody down. I didn't know Herb Earl that well. I understand learning his problems later on. I understand why it became the way it became. But, there were many people in that era. There was a kid named Gordon Schizzeri on the East Coast, too, who tried to put together, a touring company with guys between jobs. Yeah. It never works. It never works. You had the Greg Valentines, the Bob Ortons, just go down the list of the people who worked at these promotions. And if they're transient, they're always going to leave if they're getting a job with a major somewhere. So the whole concept of these things couldn't work because you couldn't promote a feud because they'd be off, the talent would be off. If you couldn't sign a guy to a contract, they weren't going to last. And to this day, Herb Abrams would say, I had this guy under contract, I had Andre the Giant under contract. I don't think he ever had anybody under contract. They should have got paid and left. That's all I know.
On paper, it sounded great. Like the stars that he had access to and the stars that he kept for a considerable amount of time. But it's like I guess he was booking it because he wouldn't put anybody over. Like every main event for weeks on end was double count out, disqualification, to run in, it's a this and that. I remember it built up to it was Doc and Paul Orndorff, and they were going to be in a cage. And I was like, and this is back reviewed, and it's not back when it was happening. I didn't have access to it back then. But I told my buddy, I was like, well, it's a cage match. We finally got to have a freaking winner. He's going to have to pull the trigger, and either Dr. Death's going to have to win or Orndorff's going to have to win. I can't wait to see how this plays out. And freaking Gordy breaks into the cage, and it ended in a disqualification. This guy booked a freaking tag team lumberjack match that ended in a count out. terrible.
No,
But
it's again, it's like it's the old everybody's gotta be pleased at the end of the night, and nobody wanted to lose. All those guys, nobody wanted to lose. And then I swear to God, I thought I saw a shoot in the middle of all this when, Steve Williams took on that guy Stevie Ray, and I thought he was gonna break him in half. I'm pretty sure
yes,
that was a shoot. If I'm wrong, I don't know, but I was there in the front row, and I'm like, "My God, he's beating the hell out of this guy." One point, he rams him up against the ring post. I said, "That looked a little stiff." And he ended up with a bloody nose, and, I didn't
yeah.
remember that match, but it looked like a shoot to me.
There's a few different versions of that, and I've talked to a guy who's allegedly friends with Steve Ray, and supposedly there's two different versions. One version is there was a dispute over drugs, and then the other version is that Steve Ray was messing around with Herb's wife or something to that effect, and that Herb gave Doc a few extra bucks to rough him up. Like, it wasn't a full on shoot, because if you watch the match, there's enough working together in some of the spots where it's not a full on shoot, but Doc cleans his clock a few times. And like I say,
Right.
that ring post spot and the punches were stiff and not getting hit in safe places, but they still managed to finish the match. It was just really weird stuff like that. And the most glaring one for me, during the angle with Orndorff, Dr. Death is hitting Orndorff with a steel chair, and this referee, who apparently wasn't like a regular trained referee, it was just some guy that Abrams knew, that he's just like, "We need a referee and you're here, well, be a referee." And he started reffing. And so Williams is hitting Orndorff with this chair, and the referee goes to try to stop him, and Doc tries to shove him off, and the referee just comes right back. Doc shoves him off again. The referee comes back right back. Doc hits this referee with a steel chair, and the referee fights to not sell it. He won't go down. So now Doc just loses and starts just wailing on this guy with the chair. And the guy's doing everything he can to not sell it. And you think, we're fixing to see a murder. And eventually wrestlers run in and they catch him, because the guy finally goes down. He hits him with the chair enough that he goes down, and Doc starts kicking him in the head, like shoot kicks to the head. And then the wrestlers come in and grab him and they stop it. And then immediately, like, the referee jumps up and heads to the back, because he didn't know any better. He thought, I'm the ref, I'm supposed to put a stop to this. So he was literally going to try to put a stop to it. But the crazy part is, it's a taped TV show, and they aired it. They didn't cut out the part where the referee makes their main event star look like a clown. They aired it on the TV show. The first time I ever saw it was a VHS tape I had bought at the mall 30 years ago, and it was on that tape. I was there watching it. It was like the best of their feud. And I was, and this is before the internet. I'm watching, I'm like, what is going on with that referee? And I rewound it back a couple of different times, and I'm like, why would you leave that on the tape? Like, how did this ever see the light of day? This wasn't live. But that's how clueless Herb and the people who worked for him were, that just leave it on there. But
speaking of the Williams Stevie Ray match, if you remember, after the bell, Stevie Ray's got the big blood, and he took a swing at Abrams.
yeah,
You remember that? Yeah, he took a swing at him. He missed by 20 feet.
because Steve, after he was on the ground, Abrams stands over Steve Ray and starts talking smack to him, and then that's when, like I say, he jumped up and swung at him, and it was a whole So weird.
That's what I'm thinking. There was a weird thing that nobody's ever really been able to explain. One of the great mystery deals.
And I was going to try to do a podcast with Steve Ray, and we never could pinpoint a time to get together and record it, because I was specifically just going to do it to kind of, I just want to talk about that whole experience in general, but be like, what was that? What was the whole Dr. Death thing? But we never figured it out. So.
Yeah. That's one of the last unanswered questions, along with the, I don't know if you know about this, the David Sammartino submitting to Ron Shaw in Philadelphia. Nobody's ever gotten a straight answer on that thing.
Yeah.
And it definitely wasn't meant to happen. And but everybody's tight-lipped, including Ron Shaw. They're old school guys, so,
yeah.
But that's one that really befuddles me. I only learned about that one like 3 years ago. I didn't know about that one. And I'm watching them. What happened here? Because I thought they were giving the kid the big push, but that was the end of that.
It was on some compilation tape I traded for years ago, and it said the infamous Ron Shaw, David Sammartino bear hug incident. I'm like, what is that? And I watched it, and you know something's off because of the fact you see obviously what's happening. The gorilla is trying to cover for it as best he can on commentary, but he really can't, but he's trying to. So then you know something's afoot. But but yeah, I just brought up the Abrams thing just to show that like not all my ideas are home runs, but
Well,
they did that dark side, and I thought, well, maybe this will be kind of fun. It'll be a humorous podcast where you can kind of have fun with some of this stuff. But after, like I say, after 12 weeks, Bob's like, I don't know that enough people find this funny to watch it every week. He's like, maybe for a few weeks, but like, we're not going to make it through the whole series. And I was like, yeah, you're right.
But bad wrestling's like bad pizza. Even when it's bad, it's good. It's like, I remember I went to school at SUNY Brockport, right near the Canadian border, and seeing Al Tomko's promotion up there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, it was so bad. It was fascinating. But yet there were people in the TV studio watching it and cheering the good guys and booing the bad guys. But I'm looking at him going, what's going on here? And he was his own champion and stuff. I mean, it was like odd, strange, but it went over. That's the stuff that fascinates me. Yeah. Stuff that you wouldn't think that anybody would pay a ticket to go see, but there they were for years. Yeah.
It's a testament to how much people love wrestling that certain people were just like, if it's wrestling, I'm going. And I remember being a kid and, I didn't distinguish good wrestling from bad wrestling. Like if it was wrestling, I wanted to see it. I wanted to read about it. I wanted to know about it. And then years later, when I started tape trading, I'd go back and watch some things from when I was a kid. And I'm like, well, that wasn't that good. I don't remember this being as bad as it is. And even now, some of the Memphis stuff I watch, I'm like, I remember this being better than this at times. But and then they do something to redeem themselves. But like I remember watching Global every day and really liking it. And I've tried now numerous times to go back and watch Global, and it's not terrible, but there's not really any real storylines. It's just matches for the sake of matches. And, it's cool to see, like Booker T and Stevie Ray in the formative years of their career and some of the odd matches that happened in the early stages of Global. And I like seeing Eddie, Gilbert, and Doug wrestle as a Dark Patriot and stuff like that. But all in all, a lot of it's not memorable. It's nothing to really go back and make it a point to watch other than.
The problem was ESPN was a problem. As much as it was a coveted spot to be in. Were they on every day at 4 PM?
Every day.
Crazy. Every day. But here's the thing. Like at one point, I remember that Terrence Garvin wrestler, that Eddie threw fire at him and they optically censored it. You didn't see anything.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that wasn't the only time they did stuff like that. Then Eddie was gone, and I've seen bungee matches and all this other weird ass stuff. And I'm like, oh man, what? It's gone soon, and sure enough, it left the scene. Of course,
and before Papa Shango, we saw Rasta the Voodoo Man out there doing
the Voodoo Man, yes,
Voodoo Man. I'm sorry,
that's right.
doing his trickery.
But here's the thing: I didn't believe the story of early Global. I hope I'm. God bless Joe Pedicino, wherever it is. But wasn't there supposed to be this big financier who was behind this new concept, and they pump millions of dollars into it or something, and then you look at TV and it's John Tatum against Billy Joe Travis. I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah,
what did they just buy? Yeah, right.
Years before Arabian princes were handing out money through email scams, they were just offering it to Joe Pedicino directly, because that's what it reads like. When you hear that story, that's what it sounds like, one of those.
Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but something went haywire there somewhere. I mean, it just didn't. It just looked like USWA Texas with a different name on it, basically.
Well, and they painted up the Sportatorium and called it the Global Dome.
The Global Dome, yes.
That's the Sportatorium. That's not a dome. What are we talking about, Joe?
I love Joe. I thought Joe was a great guy, and I will always be indebted to his 6-hour wrestling block on.
Oh yeah,
what was it, Channel 47 in Atlanta or something like that? It was awesome. Gosh, it was great. Smoky Mountain. Where else was I going to get access to that stuff? It was awesome. It was great.
Absolutely.
But, and those were the days. I watched every hour other than, I think part of it, there was an NWA show and something like Wrestling Channel. I didn't watch those because they were on locally. So I only watched the stuff I couldn't see, around
Well,
here.
think of how many people got signed to WCW at least because of Joe's wrestling block. Because you had all these guys who were bookers and involved with WCW, and I've heard them say it over the years. Yeah, I was watching the Joe Pedicino wrestling block, and I saw this guy, and I thought, man, he would be good. And I went back to the booker, and I told him, like, hey, if you reach out to this guy, and there were a lot of people got jobs based off of Joe putting them on television and them being seen in Atlanta.
Yeah, I know that's how Nick Busick ended up in the WWF as Big Billy Busick. He was known as Nick Busick in that local show that they had. And yes, a lot of people were discovered that way. I think Marcus Bagwell too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's how the Handsome Stranger came to be.
Right.
Via that. And you talked about that small promotion where like Bagwell and different guys. Didn't New Jack come out of that promotion too, I believe?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
At one point he was in a tag team with some hillbilly guy.
Yeah.
It doesn't even sound right. Doesn't even sound right, but he was learning like everybody else at that point, and that was the New Jack, if you can believe it. I still have some tapes at home. I know I smuggled a few home from that era, and I have to dig them in. But I'm afraid to stick anything in my DVR or my VCR because it's like, is that thing even going to work at this point?
Yeah.
Because I've got some treasures, including myself on old ECW tapes and stuff. I've never looked at them. I've never even opened them up. Yeah, so
those need to be on YouTube.
Did you know I was the first ECW TV announcer?
No,
Yes,
now that you say that, I can almost see in my head because I had all those VHS tapes back in the day. I can almost see that now.
The earliest show they had was on a cable access station called Channel 7 out of Philadelphia, and the host of the show was myself and Todd Gordon, and we did wraparounds from earlier matches that they had taped and interviewed some wrestlers in the studio. And I did about the first 6 episodes before I decided I was terrible.
Oh, wow.
And I walked away. Yeah. Nobody's ever seen these things, although somebody stuck one on YouTube recently. I don't know where it came from. There's one episode of it on YouTube. So
check that out.
And I'm your humble host with my big freaking long hair from back then. It was crazy. It looked like I was wearing a judge's wig from England. It was just I had this big, huge mullet back then. It was ridiculous. I regret it.
That's fun. That is definitely fun. I'll have to look that up next time I'm cruising YouTube. You never know what you're going to find on YouTube these days.
You never know what you're going to find on YouTube. That's right. That's right. Type in Mike Produces, you'll see 50 videos. Well, Mr. Jackson and I have talked now. I'm looking at our clock here. I think we talked for something like 2.5 hours. And I'm going to let him go because we're both going to pass out soon. But we've had a good time, haven't we, Gene?
We've had a great time, Bob. Thank you for doing my show. Thank you for having me on your show. It's an honor and a privilege, and I hope we get to do it again. Before
you do go, hype your current show, and if you want to let the cat out of the bag of any future projects or anything, floor is yours.
Absolutely.
Hype yourself, man, right now.
So we've got the weekly USWA podcast, and so for everything related to that, the podcast, all the social media, all that jazz, you can go to USWApodcast.com, and all the links are right there in one convenient location. It drops every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com. We're proud to be part of the WrestleCopia family of podcasts over there, featuring Ray Russell's show, the Great Dave Dynasty we talked about earlier. His show's on over there. A lot of good stuff coming soon. In August, I'm about to start doing a weekly podcast with Doug Gilbert. It's going to be called Dangerous Conversations with Doug Gilbert. And each week, me and Doug's going to be sitting down, and we're going to be basically sharing the stories of the Gilbert family, of his dad, Tommy, his brother, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, and himself, and all the shenanigans that they've been involved with over the years, and the more than 55-year history of that, family's involvement in professional wrestling, because Tommy Gilbert broke into the business in 1969, the same year that Doug was born. And they did a lot of interesting stuff. There's a lot of stories to be told, and Doug's got a lot of friends in the business, and we're going to have them on at different times. And I'm super excited about it, Bob. You know, I told Doug, I was like, man, the first few episodes is just going to be strictly questions that I have for you that I've always wanted answered about you and your family. So, as far as that podcast, you can go to DougGilbertPodcast.com, and all the links are there for the social media, for the podcast, for Doug's social medias, where you can find the podcast, which will also be at WrestleCopia.com. We've started a Gilbert Wrestling Archive YouTube channel where I've got a ton of videos of matches featuring Eddie and Doug and Tommy from out the years and from numerous promotions. So we're going to be uploading their matches to that channel. So in one convenient location, as we talk about a lot of this stuff, we can just direct you to one particular YouTube channel where you can see a lot of these things, matches and angles and interviews and all sorts of fun stuff. So, again, it's USWApodcast.com, DougGilbertPodcast.com. And if you'd like to follow me or be friends on Facebook, I'd love to have you. It's Facebook.com/GeneJackson95.
There you go. Hey, dude, do you ever sleep?
Occasionally I close my eyes for a few hours, but not enough, that's for sure.
It's like I do a weekly podcast and one bi-weekly podcast, and it's flooring me at my age. Of course, I'm decrepit now. What can I tell you? That's why I'm outdated. But hey, listen, you're doing a heck of a job. I'm so glad to meet you, and I'm proud to be on your show as well. And folks, listen for me on his the same way you've listened to the show, and you won't regret listening to his podcast. It's a good job, man. It's good. We need more of this stuff, and it's this has been a fascinating trip down memory lane. You got a great memory for this stuff, so I really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, thank you, man. Alex, I've enjoyed it, and I love doing these podcasts, but even more importantly, I love making new friends that share my love for it and have a history with it. So, there'll be times that as I've come across episodes and as we do stuff with Doug, that I may be hitting that inbox going, "Hey, Bob, what do you know about this? Can you give me any insight?" So I may be hitting you up every now and then. And if you got questions as it concerns to Memphis, especially in the '90s, I'm your guy, because if I don't know, I certainly know somebody that does.
Well, I'm still living down Tino Santana. You know what I mean? This is a little insider joke, fans. That's it. That's all.
It takes so little these days now to just completely undo
I know.
decades
Spell my
worth
name
of
right.
work.
Spell my name right. It's an easy name to spell. That's why, Bob Smith, anybody can spell. That's just write it down. It's perfect. Hey, folks, this is Gene Jackson. Thanks again. I really appreciate this, and continued success, my friend.
Thank you very much, and anytime.
This is Joe Walsh. One thing I do when I'm not playing rock and roll is get on the air as an amateur radio operator. Also called ham radio, is a communication service provided by ordinary people just like you and me. We have a national emergency communication system in place 24/7, 365. Find out more about amateur radio at arrl.org/whatishamradio. See you on the air.
Well, there you have it. It's another in a long line of conversations with a newcomer to me, but I'm glad I met Gene Jackson, and I think you may be too. I think you're going to have a new favorite show coming up very soon. Great podcast, great guy, and I really appreciated the time I spent with him. So let's do the usual wrap-ups and commercial announcements and what have you. Our website, outdatedwrestlinghour.buzzsprout.com, where every episode of the show will be listed for time memoriam as long as I'm doing it. That's right. No Patreon for old episodes from me. Just click and enjoy. You can go all the way back. We've had an array of terrific guests with more to come. Terry Sullivan, the old Detroit ring announcer and commentator for television. Dave Drayson, right? Those great Detroit days. We've had people like Dave Dynasty and Chris Carter from the WWA or Bruiser Bedlam. Just go down the list. It's not the usual array of folks, but I think it's all interesting. And they all had an important impact on the history of pro wrestling. So check out all of our old shows if you haven't done so already. This There's some new stuff. There's some famous stuff. There's some not so famous stuff. We have journalists. We have writers, you name it. And I think you're going to kick out of most of it. So check us out at outdatedwrestlinghour.buzzsprout.com, the same place where you can check out the Outdated Wrestling Hour fan club for a nominal fee. You can help perpetuate the ongoing antics of this particular program, plus the Outdated Entertainment Hour. Look for the Outdated Entertainment Hour, the same places you find this podcast. There we talk about music, film, the arts, television, radio, you name it. We're going to have it on the show. Comic books is coming up. So keep an eye out for that. Write to us, outdatedwrestling@gmail.com. Find me on Facebook. I'm the only Bob Smith that's singing with BB King. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on, you can find me on Threads. Outdated Bob is my name. And we do post some things on Instagram. Just keep an eye out if you'd be so very kind. I guess that's it for right now. It's been a very busy period in putting shows together. I have some big ones in the can and some big ones coming up. So I better mosey on down the line. And, well, I got a lot of work to do. Miles to go before I sleep, said the famous poet, right? I believe that was Robert Frost. Or am I too old to remember that? Anyway, thank you all. See us next time on the Outdated Wrestling Hour. And in the words of Ringo Starr, I will continue to say this. I think it's important, particularly these days. Peace and love. That should never be antiquated.